All right, back. Another special edition and episode with longtime friend Curt Wood, who has been in the state and local government circuits for quite a long time. Most recently, the CIO for the state of Massachusetts. Is here with us today, and I'm super glad you're here, Curt. And then Jack, uh, given our guest here today, is there something top of mind that you think we should touch on?
There are so many things, Justin. Welcome to the show, Curt. It's always nice. Number one, I get to work with Justin all the time, and that is exemplary. But when we get to add somebody else to the mix, it's pretty amazing, right? So we get to actually add some more stuff. For those of you who have listened to Justin and I over the last couple of weeks, the most recent version of the Cybersecurity Priorities Report just came out. In addition, all the great work that Curt's done since 1975 in his government career. Curt was actually the executive director of that. He actually formed the organizing function, brought a lot of those smart folks to the table that Justin and I have been able to talk with and talk about in the course of the show over the last couple of weeks. But in the course of those discussions, and in fact, in the course of doing a webinar for the CPR some time ago, it was pretty clear that that there was a lot of information we could gather from Curt around one of the other organizations that's not pwned and isn't NuHarbor Security, that provides assistance and guidance into municipalities and public sector folks. And I thought it'd be fun to talk a little bit about that, Justin, if it's great. And I'm talking about CISA, CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, run by Jen Easterly currently. And just really, really quickly, for those of you who may not be familiar with CISA, originally it was pulled out of one of the directorates inside of the Department of Homeland Security, with really the focus to improve security in .gov domains and to do a better job of identifying and better understanding security for critical infrastructure. You know, things like what should they do for assessment or awareness training, what have you. But one of the things it's not supposed to be, right, that sometimes it gets the reputation of, is it's not supposed to be the Cavalry, right? Folks should not be sitting back waiting for Jen to arrive and fix everything. And as you see, you know, in the day-to-day, she's really working hard on generating awareness, generating a common understanding. But I don't think that she presupposes that this is supposed to be the Cavalry either. And so that all being said, Curt, welcome to the show. I'd like to kick it off with a question like specifically related to the way that we've discussed it in the past, which is, you know, where do you see natural overlaps and conflicts, right, in the shared responsibilities as both a statewide officer and now, you know, helping a lot of different organizations out, in the shared responsibilities for state and local governments, and then with CISA riding over the top of it? Where do you see that sort of friction popping up?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Thanks, Justin. Nice to see you all. Happy New Year. Great question. I mean, I think the way I've been thinking about this over the past several years, and certainly I've been, like you mentioned, I've been in government many, many years, and certainly folks on the state side, local side, but I've also a lot of experience with the federal partners as well over the years. And I think when we think about, kind of this whole protectorate, from a CISA perspective, I look at this organization that, was spun, like you said, was spun off. And I think the first thing I think about, really is the relevance of the organization itself. And I think, underlying all this, really, to me, the federal government, by doing that, has extended its position that this is a top priority for all of us, meaning that, they've taken this organization and taken out of a parent organization, have actually created this dedicated group led by, an official that has wide responsibility across the country. I think, from a state and local perspective, over the years, I think it's been a struggle to actually get focus to prioritize cybersecurity. I think we've made great progress over the past probably 5 years or so. I think that's part and parcel to, the federal government mandating or directing CISA to start to take some action to build this, wide-ranging framework. I like to call it a framework, a foundation framework that really elevates cybersecurity and mandates it to be an organization that provides leadership, provides expertise, provides standards, situational awareness, things of that nature that really lends itself to better cybersecurity and really promotes the cyber efforts across the country. And each year, I think as we traverse this journey, they continue to build, they continue to find their way. And I think to your point about CISA is not going to be the Cavalry, and I think you're right. However, I do think they provide such an important role in government in the federal space, from a relationship management perspective, championing our Congress, championing, the dedication and the commitment of standards and framework and policy. When you talk about infrastructure, they work with, all of our critical infrastructure across the country. When we think about cyber, sometimes I think, at a state or local level, we get stuck in the day-to-day operations of our, agencies. But I think the larger component here really is the critical infrastructure that actually is needed in order to run our government operations or a private operation, whether it be water treatment facilities, would it be electrical grids, communication companies. These all come first to mind, and they all have a nexus to really kind of the federal structure in this regard. So I think, we talk about overlap. I think, certainly I think, we've made some great progress. I think there's areas that, we have maybe too much overlap, but then in most cases, we're still struggling to communicate with each other. So I think, when it comes to the CISA engagement, they have regional people assigned to each state that work with the leadership within a state to make sure that, first of all, there's a situational awareness when things pop up in the vendor community or the industry itself or the government space. There's a communication flow down and up. For years, I think the federal government got criticized a little bit for, kind of just sucking all the information out of people and not providing anything back. But I think that's actually changed. And I think it's changed because people in the state and local space now have the comfort and they have the confidence and they have a level of expertise that's been built out over the last several years that really allows them to communicate up, communicate across. And I think CISA has done a nice job adapting to that framework as well. And I think, we view them, in my experience, we view them as a valued partner, a group that provides leadership, guidance, framework, opportunity. They've been a huge champion in funding at the national level. I think, many states, are starting to catch up with some of the funding commitments, but the federal government still has a ton of money there and investments, and it's all the way from the White House down. So I think, CISA is still a new agency overall. But I think, they adapt, they're making progress, and they provide certainly a valuable resource for all of us in this fight around cyber.
Cool. Justin, let me ask you, because, we deal with a lot of different, and you specifically deal with a lot of different state and local agencies. And at the same time, you're sort of at the center of the way we think about advancing into the next generation of threat intel. Where do you see CISA fitting, right? And CISA's ability to generate shared information across, the various communities that they touch?
Curt, I think I loved what Curt said about the communication framework. He was talking about creating the foundational framework, but more importantly, I think he kind of brought that all together and saying they provide a critical function, which is making sure that CIS is talking to their peers and counterparts in the feds, and they're relaying information back down. I think the role of CISA is their most important role is one of communication, and it's one of awareness. And I don't think they're necessarily going to be the agency that has all the answers, nor should they be. It's a big threat landscape, and we all have to do our part to contribute. The value to me is, kind of come back to what Curt was saying is that we have the foundational framework. They establish a level of trust and communication where we feel like we can communicate back to them, they can communicate to us, and the idea of being with the right partnership and the right shared responsibility model and trust, where the sum of the parts is more than the whole, and everybody can win out of this.
Let me just add on to Justin saying, I give you an example. I think, again, when I look at the most recent program the last couple of years around the state and local cybersecurity grant program, if you just look at that and you kind of look at the work that's been done, CISA and the federal partners and state partners, did a lot of work up front. You speak of Jen Eastley. Her office has been very open. She travels around the country, meets with executives across the state and local government. She's not sitting down in D.C., not paying attention. I think she's brought that to the forefront about collaboration and communication. I think when you look at the state local cybersecurity grant, they've built this kind of foundation here, and they've given us program areas to look towards, right? And fun. And really what that means is that, we've identified, collaboratively these areas, when we talk about municipal, vulnerabilities or state vulnerabilities, these are common known vulnerabilities that, sometimes we just, they're almost impossible to deal with. We may be a funding issue. It may be, a resource issue. And I think the point being, CISA has prioritized this through the federal government and said, listen, we're going to put some money, where our mouth is, and these are the most critical and prioritized areas that we can focus on. So being able to do that and getting states to the table, and again reinforcing the criticality of cyber hygiene, and some of these are very basic things, right? But reinforcing, at educational institutions, at schools, at our businesses, providing cyber incident response plans for small businesses that don't have that. Those are important roles that state and local government people really don't do. Whereas the federal government through CISA actually has programs that they can work with the community, work with legislatures to educate people, inform people, and reinforce the importance of this. And then certainly tie some programmatic goals to it and some funding to it. But again, being that resource and being that federal government agency that's dedicated to this, I think is critical. And people do listen. And I think that's important to be able to listen, knowing the federal government has this organization that's solely focused on our critical infrastructure and our cyber related areas. And then, how do we meld this together? How can we best, be a resource and an evangelist and a leader in the space for our municipalities and our state governments and businesses?
I like it. I mean, one of the things that's interesting when you mentioned the fact that the CISA team and their founding is sort of a demonstration of the fact that cybersecurity has become more important, right, in these divided times of ours. I thought it was really interesting in doing a little research for the piece, the fact that in 2018, when this was created, when the agency was created, it was a unanimous vote from the Senate. Right? Nobody voted against it. Everybody let their partisanship sort of go behind them because this is a problem that affects everybody. Justin, you had made a comment that I want to follow up with Curt on, which was you had said that CIS is not supposed to have all the answers, right? And you had described the need for a really well-articulated shared responsibility model. Curt, when you think about it, when you talk to other state CIOs, right, in your current role and even before when you were still occupying the seat, you probably ran into lots of different kinds of architectures, right? We know that statutorily, some states work one way, some municipalities work another, tribal authorities work a third way. Everybody sort of has their own thing. If CIS's responsibility is in part to help to inform the work that they're doing, how do you see them, learning enough to be a useful partner to those organizations? And also, how do you recommend that those organizations feed that information up to make CISA more responsive to what they need?
Great question. Great area. So I think, I think about, kind of the relationship management aspect of things. And I think, one of the areas I think CISA has made some progress is having people that are in the area, in your community, right? So in New England or Massachusetts, let's just say New England, we have some dedicated resources there. And these folks, in my experience, and if they didn't, it would be my responsibility as a state CIO that oversaw the enterprise technology security for the Commonwealth. It would be my responsibility to make sure that we reached out to CISA, to make sure that invite them into our house, to make sure that they understand the functions of the government. Because one thing is for sure, no government's the same. State Massachusetts, for example, it's 351 cities and towns. They do everything differently. You have a Commonwealth of Mass with 125 executive branch agencies, even though we have a standard framework. Each agency kind of has their own mission. They have their own regulatory framework. They have their own statutory framework. They have their own geography, people, everything, mission. So, it'd be almost impossible for CISA to actually understand and appreciate the nuance, as a term we like to use, right, for all how government works. What is critical, though, and I think what they've made progress and they continue to make progress on, is making sure that you develop these relationships at the state local level. Leverage your state CIOs, leverage your state CISO, your public safety officials, your municipal associations, your local government associations. And I think every state is charted a little bit different, but I think CISA has adapted that. It's a playbook. But and I think it's building that relationship, building that partnership, being available. So if I need something, can I call them up? Can you all come in and do a presentation for me? Can you give me an update of what's going on in this program? Or can you kind of sit and listen? And we're building an incident response framework. When we built an incident response framework in Massachusetts for our municipal governments along with state, CISA was at the table. So I think it's important to kind of make sure there's inclusion there, but it's a two-way street. It's CISA. CISA just can't drop in and just kind of take over everything. It's just impossible to do that. You have to be invited in. You have to be, you have to be a willing participant. And I think that's incumbent on state and local government and having the right people in those seats as well to make sure that you can work on a level playing field and set expectations early on.
It's fun to talk about the role that they have and that they don't have. And I think it'd be fun because, Justin and I have been doing this a long time, and Justin's been at the center of a lot of these discussions. And so I want to ask you a question, if I could, partner in crime, which is that last week at a CISA panel, which for those in the audience is the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They talk about a lot of different things, particularly associated with federal government purview, regulation, what have you. But on that panel, they had folks from both the Department of Veterans Affairs and from the Treasury, right? And these people actually said the words, "We would like to see CISA be more prescriptive and demand that standards be met," right? This is basically the thrust of this. Now, as somebody who, on a daily basis is dealing with the different levels of appetite for security, the friction that gets created, Justin, how do you think that CISA's role as defining those would be accepted by the people who may have to implement it?
Jack, that's also a good question for you, as someone who's helped kind of write articles and legislation in the past, and kind of how you thought about it. But for the folks that I've interacted with, I think they use the term prescription and recommendations and best practices as almost synonymous terms, but I don't think they really mean them that way, right? And very specifically is there's a lot of organizations, and I say like organizations encompassing state, local, municipal government, like the whole thing. They're looking for recommendations and best practices, how they can get incrementally better. I don't think anybody is expecting to wave a magic wand and be perfect. But in the world of trying to prescribe all the things that you could do, you set the bar so high that people just put their hands up and say, like, I just might as well accept the risk because I'm never going to hit this bar, right? And so I think there's a lot of risk in being super prescribed because that's a trade-off. You're just going to immediately turn people off, and rather the motion needs to be create something that's overarching, be clear on the intent and the goal, and it gives people a creative way to solve this challenge, right? And keep in mind too, like the audience of which you're trying to prescribe these things to sometimes are completely overloaded or are not technical, and they can read it but have no idea what it means. So you gotta keep that in mind too. So to me, I'd like to see more best practices and recommendations, but most importantly, be clear on the intent and the goal, so you can actually help people.
Yeah, I completely agree. I remember back, it was in the late 1990s, right, when we created the ISACs, or the PDD 63 stuff. And the idea was that there'd be shared information, and from that would come recommendation. There was almost a specific doctrine that describes what you were just talking about, right? Which was, we're going to look around, we're going to make our best recommendations that people can aspire to, but we're never going to demand that they do it. And, as I was reading the notes from the CSIS discussion, it kind of felt a little like the folks may have been saying, well, we would do whatever we're supposed to do if they would just tell us what to do. It's not our fault that we haven't done it. And, you had mentioned the shared responsibility of it a little bit earlier. And again, that obviously reminds me of AWS, right? The shared responsibility model, and the idea that these organizations and the individuals in these organizations have to take some responsibility for doing something. And maybe they aspire to a recommendation or a best practice that gets described by Jen and the team at CISA, but it should be part and parcel with just doing what they think is right, in doing something. So, no, I think that works for me as well.
Chuck, if I could real quickly though, like you've been in this exact position where you've been asked to help write guidance and find the right words for this type of thing in this situation, right? And if memory serves me correctly, it was for application security, which by the way is like one of the hardest things to do. Like philosophically, when you were doing it, like philosophically, like what was your approach and like how did you think about it?
Well, it was interesting, right? I was younger and perhaps a little bit more idealistic, right? And it was so obvious that if I could identify all the vulnerabilities in the software, then I should probably fix the really bad ones at least. And if I'm going to be creating software that does things like, manage healthcare, devices, or, decides where planes go or munitions or what have you, you really want to make sure those are secure enough before you use them a lot. And what it turned out was that until it was demonstrated that they were so flawed, right, that became the biggest thing people worried about, it sort of took second place. Right, in the hierarchy, or maybe 11th place, but in the hierarchy of it, we had at one point in time, DISA was recommending that application security review, not necessarily us, but something be done for almost all these things, and people just signing waivers all over the place. Oh, don't have time for that. If you don't want this thing to happen, then we'll follow your process. But if you want it to happen, then you really have no choice. And it's sort of like the extortion of a pressing timetable, right? And it's hard. And it's hard. And I think there's something you mentioned before that was right in the money as well, which was, the capacity of the audience to understand it, right? I mean, we saw this when I was working on some legislation. This has got to be 10 or 15 years ago for the grid. And they couldn't get it to the floor. They couldn't get it to the floor of the House or the Senate because of the fact that it was too complicated. And I changed like 9 words. But constituents aren't going to vote cybersecurity regulations for the grid when they're really more worried about, is the military going to be funded? Are the checks going to get written for social services? It just doesn't rise to that level for them. And so, maybe things are changing. But I think that the first thing to do in getting people to accept it is to prove to them that it's worth all the friction and chaos and sort of like the disruption that it's going to cause for them. Yeah. So Curt, if I go back to sort of sum up one of the discussions that we had that touches on some of the stuff that Justin and I were just talking about. Mm-hmm. In the conversation we had a little earlier, you had made the comment that IT and cybersecurity, they're super critical. Everybody cares about them, yeah. But they're just elements, right? They're elements of a much broader security strategy, defensive resilience strategy, especially for like a statewide officer who's got critical services to offer, what have you. Can you talk a little bit about that complexity and how people weigh, to Justin's questions, how do you weigh cybersecurity in that mix? And do you see a role for CISA in helping statewide officers or even municipal officers advocate for more cybersecurity goodness and a higher priority for that kind of work?
Yeah, I think again, I think you fellas hit it on the head. I mean, I just doubling back a little bit. I think about cybersecurity is this thing that, like, at times I think people think it's somebody else's job, right? In like just mentioned it, you mentioned it. It's like people don't worry about they sign waivers because they're trying to get their mission done, right? And it's always somebody else's responsibility. I think over the years, I think that's been a dangerous position along with IT or digital. It's the same thing. And I've been evangelizing for years. That it's just not about the IT guy or gal. It's just not about the security guy or gal. We've turned this into, kind of, a risk avoidance, or it's somebody else's thing. And I think, when I look at it, and what I've been evangelizing over the last couple of years is really, we all own it as a community. And I think about it in very basic terms from my perspective and my experience. And I try to break it down simply when I talk to people, when I talk to leaders, I talk to the governors, I talk to town leaders, whomever, legislators. At the end of the day, what is the mission of state and local government? if you just asked that very basic question, and I think it's two things. I think it's, we're obligated to make sure that there is access to services for our population, for our communities, which are people or businesses or whomever we define as a community. And I also look at it that we provide services proactively. So it's basically people need to access systems or services, and then we need to be proactive to provide that. And then you take a look at that, and what does that really mean? And we've kind of framed the term. We've gone away from certain terms and moved back into some older terms like continuity of operation, continuity of government. Then we filter it down to, well, what does that really mean? Well, it really means resiliency. It means availability. It means access. So you take a look at that, and honestly, cybersecurity is really shouldn't be special in the fact that it really should be part of your fabric and DNA. And what I mean by that, everybody has a role in this, whether it be the agency head, the legal team, the person that is responsible for answering the phone, the contact center, the customer, whomever it may be. It's really about all of us. So I think, it goes back to some very basics again, and, retraining the brain at times and really continue to evangelize the very basics. And I think some of the programs, that I've seen lately that really touch on this are really, areas that we don't think traditionally about cyber, right? But I think about, making sure that our young children are educated in grammar school or middle school. That there's a basic training and education, that started early on. I mean, our young people are using technology, computers much more than we did at our age. They probably use more than I do now, right? So, how do we educate the family unit? How do we think about that? In our day-to-day lives. How do we develop better vocational programs? How do we build this program into school? These to me are all part and parcel. And you look at some of the public-private partnerships that are in play now, or like some of our cyber centers or cyber ranges. Again, this is more about the technology, but if you kind of break that technology and product and try to look at actually what we're trying to do. And again, I think the federal government with a CISA or your leadership within a state, stepping back and again, understanding, what the root issue is here. It's not all about technology. You can buy, and Jay, Justin, you and I have had this conversation in the past. You can buy all the technology you want. That's great. And you can buy a million different cybersecurity technologies and still not solve your problem, right? So, I mean, I think you really need to kind of think about this in a more holistic approach. And I think, that's through just, generational investment, continuing the education. It's almost like doing a PSA to your people continually, so people start to kind of, it starts to saturate, it starts to sink in, and it just becomes part of who we are. And I think that's where, the federal government, I think, can play a role about educational awareness and investments, certainly educating your business leaders. Like I said, the program we talked a minute ago about, CISA has these programs where they bring in small businesses to the table. They help small businesses. Small businesses are not in position to help themselves time. So, I mean, I think it's to me, that's what it's really about. How do we kind of advance that? And how do we keep this conversation? How do we talk about outcomes? How do we talk about, investments and priorities, things like this? Because cybersecurity, and, we tend to kind of live in this world where everybody gets afraid of, the state nation actor, and, we see TV movies on it and all these and I get it. But there's some basic elements underneath here that we need to make sure that our people are understanding of, because I think it hits on the very basics of our community, that they own this. They need to own this along with all of us.
I think that's a really solid way to close about the responsibility and the ability to succeed so long as we're partnering together. Justin, I don't know if you had any other questions, but I'm feeling pretty great, and I want to make sure we can take advantage of Curt again in the future, so I'm not going to run too long now.
Yeah, we should probably just wrap here then, because we could go on all day.
Excellent. So Curt, listen, thanks a million for being along here. Please, if you haven't listened to it, take a listen to the webinar that Curt participated in for the CPR, which he was the executive director of. There's a lot of great information that came out of Curt and folks like Mike, Greg, and others to help you out. And I really appreciate this follow-up, Curt, because I think it's helpful for our audience to hear things from a different perspective than they'd ordinarily get from just Justin and I.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Good stuff.
Yeah, great. Well, for anybody and everybody listening to this, thank you so much for your time. As always, Curt, It's a real pleasure. Anytime I can have a conversation with you. If you like this episode, please like it, share it with all your friends. Questions, comments, you can find us at pwned@NuHarborSecurity.com, and we'll get you on the next episode.
Thanks all. Have a great day.